Good evening and welcome back to Pixels to Politics. Tonight, Dougie and I are joined by a special guest, a seasoned detective with nearly 30 years of experience in law enforcement. Together, we'll dive into the essence of police work, dispel misconceptions, and explore the realities of detective work. Join us for an enlightening conversation as we delve into the challenges, rewards, and future of law enforcement. Our guest tonight is none other than Adam DeCamp, a special agent in charge for the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, also known as the DCI. He has served in the DCI nearly 28 years as an investigator and administrator. He is currently the supervisor for the Major Crime Unit, which investigates crimes against persons in public trust cases in the south central part of the state. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you both doing?
Hey, can't complain. Got some audio issues figured out, it's all
That's
good.
right. Technology.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I'm also doing very well. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think it would be
So,
awesome. Oh, sorry, did you want
mhm.
to?
No, please go ahead, Dougie.
I actually think it would be awesome to kind of start from the beginning, like, uh, what made you want to be an officer? Did you want to be a detective from the beginning? Like, what was that start like?
Yeah, no, I love that question because I think where a lot of people start, especially it doesn't matter if it's law enforcement or doctors or military, it doesn't matter. I saw it on TV and it would look really cool. Like that was kind of my first real exposure to like, I want to be a cop. It wasn't anything other than that. I was young, the growing up in the 80s and 90s, the shows like the X-Files were on. Like that was the big show at the time. And, Mulder and Scully were on there and just like the best job in the world. So kind of when I started, my original goal was like, I want to be an FBI agent. Like that looks like the best job ever. And kind of as time went on, I realized like I wanted to work. I wanted to work. I wanted to work homicide cases. I wanted to work death cases, and that gets worked more at a local level than a federal level. As I kind of realized as I got older, and I was very fortunate to get hired before I had graduated college, actually, by the Division of Criminal Investigation, and I joined them. Went off, and I've had an amazing career since then.
Wow. Um, I wonder if I know I used to watch a lot of Law and Order SVU, and
Yeah.
a part of me felt the same way where I was just like, man, I also want to be, out there catching these people who are doing just the most heinous things, and so I relate to that a lot,
Right.
actually. I definitely relate to
Right.
that.
And I think a lot of people do, right? I think that's when you talk to, where do motivations come from? They come from our homes, how we see mom and dad and neighbors live. But a lot comes from, from popular media, TV, movies, now of course social media. Like people just kind of get going. Unfortunately, I think this is where a lot of social media influencers try and make it too. But we'll let that slide.
Yeah, social media is a pretty common topic that we end up talking about. It's kind of becoming more and more prevalent as we realize it shapes a lot of our perceptions and our views. So it's not that surprising that even early on, before social media, TV played such a big part.
Right.
So before you made it to the detective stuff, what was training like?
Yeah. So training was. One thing I talk about with training is, the structured training. When I went through in 1996, it was 14 weeks, this paramilitary style academy, marching, wearing a uniform, push-ups, sit-ups, uh, lots of discipline. There was classroom, there's the fun stuff as well, like, getting to drive fast and shoot guns and do that kind of stuff. But really, I tell people with law enforcement, the best training is just like life, like just going out and living and being a part of society. Man, that's the best training you can get from law enforcement because that's what we deal with on a daily basis as people in their real lives. So the structured training, yeah, it was great. It was an experience. I said in 1996 it was 14 weeks. Now today in Iowa, the same officer going through the same training, I think, is 22 weeks.
Mm.
So I just think different setup, obviously technology and things like that play a change. But the biggest training you can get for law enforcement is just being involved in society.
That's fair. Makes
Hmm.
sense. Um,
What do you
s-
think the training, the structured training, what do you think that sort of offers to officers that is not necessarily grasped out in like the real world experience?
Yeah, great question. So that's going to be things like the uniformity that comes along with it. So we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. It helps define the purpose of why we do what we do. It makes it so we also have, while we don't have identical ways of thinking, we do have common ways of thinking, and that's so we can work together in a moment's notice in high stress situations, and we don't have to think about it. We don't have to ask someone what their plan is. We should know it because we've all kind of been trained the same way.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like just tailoring, the various agents and detectives to, when stressful things happen, they kind of default to a particular methodology or a way of going about the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Do you think that the training that's offered to DCI agents is sufficient for what they're asked to do? Or, given enough time and resources, do you think it should be more?
So I think at the base level, that introductory level, it's the right amount because it's teaching you to be a cop, right? It's teaching you the paperwork, the handcuffing, the moral responsibilities that go along with it. So at the onset, it's definitely the right balance. As your career goes on, it relies more on the OJT, right? The real life experiences to learn, because to have a training class that covers all variables and possible options in law enforcement it'd be impossible. It just that's all you would do. You'd be in class. Like, oh, by the way, this happened yesterday, or oh, by the way, that happened. We need to address this. So definitely at the core, and sorry, at the start rather, it's definitely enough. But I think moving forward, I just don't know that there's a better way to do it.
Yeah. And do you think that, I think we hear all the time, right? That like, oh, if there was just more training, bad things wouldn't happen. Do you
Right.
do you believe that's true, or do you think that that's just sort of like wishful thinking?
I think there's some truth in it, only because you know, we evolve. Law enforcement, we absolutely have to evolve. As humans, we of course evolve. So we learn new things. We need to bring people up to new ways, better ways of doing things. One of the examples I talk about when I talk with folks about this is, we all of us remember Columbine, the shooting. Maybe not all of
Hmm.
us. You guys are you. Some of your listeners are young, but this 1999 shooting at Columbine High School, and the officers waited outside and they did things like that. But that was that was part of the training in some locations at that time. Is you kind of wait, you get enough people, then you go in. But we've seen over time that that's not the right way. That's not the most efficient way. I shouldn't say it's not the right way because I'm definitely not criticizing those officers. Um, but there's ways now as time has gone on that we can just do things a little bit differently. So yeah, training can absolutely benefit us to prevent bad things from happening. But at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down, most of this, or if not all of this, comes down to personal choice. And officers, you're held to a high moral standard in that, and we should be. We're serving on behalf of the people. And so if we're going to be held to a high moral standard, the personal accountability has got to be just as high. And it's really got to be that guiding force. So, we can't legislate away problems. We can't legislate away uh, human decision. But we can, as law enforcement officers, hold ourselves and others to account when they step out of line.
Yeah. So with these, and I'll just ask this question too. So, assuming that there was going to be more training, right? What is the barrier to keep that from being a reality? Like, is it money? Is it like the workload that would, overburden the officers that have to like work stuff every day? Um, or is it a mix of things? Like kind of what barriers exist to that?
I think those, time and money and caseload. I think those are all part of it. But part of it, I think the other equation is part of that equation is like when and where does it stop? And where do we start and stop training? Like we receive a lot of training today that we were not receiving 28 years ago, and I'm glad we do because it holds us again to that higher standard. But we also, how far down that track do we go? Do we try and do, excuse me? Do we try and do training that is trying to root out the 1% of problems, or do we focus on the big issues, the issues that really impact the law enforcement community, law enforcement as a profession, and the community's interaction with law enforcement? So I think we have to stay focused, and we can't again try and chase down every possible problem because we can't legislate it away, and we can't out train human behavior.
You receive any training nowadays that you wish you did not receive?
Yeah, every year when legal update comes out. No, it's. Look, I do think that again the training that we're getting now, as opposed to 28 years ago or 20 years ago, is much more focused, much more intentional. It is that we can always say, "Gosh, I wish I didn't have to go to this training," or "Why do I have to go to that training?" But in reality, again, like we're in the service business, and we need to be out there to serve people. And if we have issues, we need to address those issues. We need to be held accountable. And so I think that accountability can come through some of that training. So there's not really anything that I wish we didn't have, but there are some that I enjoy much more than others. So
Gotcha. All right. So I think maybe now would be a good time to ask. Obviously you're at nearly 30 years of experience. What about detective work has evolved over the last 30 years that I know you talked a little bit about the training evolving, but what else in the detective work has evolved?
yeah, so I think there's a couple things. The first I like to talk about is the CSI effect, right? So the early 2000s, CSI Las Vegas comes on the scene, and it makes detective work look even cooler than I thought it could ever look, right? It's they're going to scenes and they are swabbing a drop of blood, getting a DNA profile and a geolocation on that person within 5 minutes. And so I think that kind of people start to expect that. They're like, well, I saw it on TV, and this is how they did it. So that's not exactly how the world works, but I think that that's something that I've seen evolve over the years. The other thing that has probably made the most dramatic impact has been technology. It's been a game changer on the use of technology, and that's everything from advancements in DNA. We can now use a drop of blood to not only identify a person, but there's the ability to go out and identify the family that this drop of blood came from. So that's that genealogy it's amazing technology. You also then you have the cell phones, which most cell phones are anything but phones for folks, but they provide real time data as to what a person is doing, where they've been, who they've talked to. So we see that. We then also see surveillance cameras. We have surveillance cameras everywhere. People, 20 years ago, heck, even 15 years ago, to have a surveillance camera on a house was unheard of, except for your high-end houses and high-end communities. And now it's doorbells are cameras, and that doorbell sends a message to your phone. So if you are or are not home, but you have your phone close to you, you know who's at the house. So those things have really benefited law enforcement through their advancement over these 27, 28 years, and it's really opened a lot of avenues, and I tell people a lot that it's probably part of the it's probably something that's going to impact the reduction in crime as we go along, because people just can't get away from it. So yeah, so I think technology's been a positive impact for the most part, but it's really changed in the last 2+ decades.
Yeah, that sounds
Right.
scary to me. The whole time I'm just thinking like surveillance state, surveillance state.
Yeah,
I
right.
understand. I the uses for catching criminals I think is so crazy, but and I love how like positive your tone of voice is with it. I'm just sitting there
Yeah,
thinking like the FBI, yay!
yeah. Right, and I completely get that, right? And that's I think that same thing, as I'm driving down the road. It used to be that, when I kind of the early 2000s, 2010, somewhere in there, they used to talk about like the average person is seen on surveillance like 25 times a day.
Wow,
Now that number, I haven't seen it lately. That
twenty four
I
seven.
can't
I'm sure.
imagine.
You have a
Yeah,
webcam in
it's
your
like,
home.
no, right. You've got your phone. We could talk about
Yeah.
things like, if you have a Google or an Alexa,
Oh
they're
yeah. Oh
all
yeah.
they're always listening,
Yeah.
right? Siri is always listening. Your TV, in a lot of cases, always listening. So that information is, it's valuable for resolving cases. But you're right, when we talk about the surveillance state and Big Brother and those kind of things, right? There are a lot of constitutional and moral and ethical issues that have to really be worked through to make sure that that information is not misused.
For sure. There's been a lot of battles in the Senate right now actually with well the FBI in terms of this and how often they need to get a warrant, to access this information and I just keep watching it. Just when you were talking about it, it just made me think of that. It was pretty funny. Just chuckled.
Yeah. Yep. Right.
But no, but it's crazy. It sounds absolutely wild to go from um these like really long sequencing of DNA, probably kind of by hand or by a simple machine to, well, we've got it. The machine, analyzed it. We have the sequence. We know exactly who the name of this person is. We know what they look like. We know where they are at this very moment. We know their brother. We know their sister. Like, oh, he's just chilling on the couch with his mom at home right now. Like, there he is.
Yep.
Oh,
There's the CSI effect, right?
yeah. Oh, for sure,
Yeah,
for sure.
for sure.
Um, wow. Okay, so in terms of just that in itself, the technology and how it advances, what I assume criminals themselves are finding ways to combat this stuff and avoid,
Sure.
detection and what does that look like, without spilling the top secrets.
Right. Right. Well, I think, one thing is, law enforcement's by and large a reaction business.
Hmm,
Um, it's we don't a lot of times we don't know what the crimes are until someone commits them. So when we talk about kind of how criminals are using it, like they're generally criminals, people who want to do ill to others and by whatever means are out in front, and law enforcement's got to react and kind of play catch up. So where they're at in the, really operationally today, I don't know. And I don't know that anyone in law enforcement knows. But, we see that technology, the use of AI, now
hmm,
voice generation is kind of, some of the new stuff where they can take someone's voice and, make that, what I call kind of the grandparent phone call, and say, Grandma, I'm in jail. I need, $50,000, or, they're going to throw me in, a foreign country prison. So we're seeing some of that. We're seeing people, with that technology, and whether it's open source, whether it's posting to social media, things like that, people are able to go out and not only steal identities, which I think is people have been doing for a while, but we see now where they're able to recreate someone else's life,
hmm,
or they're able to take information and make these phone calls, send these emails, send text messages, and have information that's verifiable, um, and makes them appear to be legitimate. And I think those are the scary things. It's I actually just talked with a sheriff today about a very similar thing happening in small county Iowa. And this person was out, tens of thousands of dollars because of it. So
Mm.
technology, technologies can be a scary thing definitely when it's in the wrong hands.
Yeah, and I mean these people can commit this crime in particular just at home at their desk with
Right.
the
Right.
simplest of computer. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't take much. So
Yeah. The truest form of work from home. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I would also I've kind of want to just jump to this question because I think it's a good one. But
Yeah.
what has been or what have been some of the most significant challenges you've faced in your career, in your time?
His
Yeah.
family, probably.
Probably. Yeah. I have a hellion of a son. Like I can't even. That's a whole nother podcast, and I'll need my therapist here to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, but I think the biggest challenges, as a young officer, I would say kind of that biggest challenge is trying to grapple with the why. Like, why do people do this to each other? Why do why do certain people just have this propensity to get into trouble? And that was one of the things I remember just as a young officer trying to figure out, like, it didn't make sense to me. Like, you just need to make good choices. Like, it doesn't make sense to stay out until 3 in the morning, slamming back drinks, and then jump in your car and try and drive home. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, we should be better than that. It doesn't make sense to assault your loved one. Like, how do we get past that? So early on in my career, I remember that being something like, keeping a positive perspective through that was a challenge. And I think we see that today even with young officers. I do now, kind of looking back, like they have that same struggle of you can't look at everyone as a criminal. You can't look at everyone as an abuser or as being violent just because the last 10 people you dealt with were that way. And so I think that's a real challenge that law enforcement faces. And I think kind of as my career has gone on, I think one of the things that really has challenged me, and I think challenges other folks kind of as they kind of go through their careers, is where do we as a society go? It's like, where do we go if we abandon the sense of justice that this country was kind of founded on? Where do we go if we get to that point? Where do we go when we have no bail set? Like, what does that look like for law enforcement? What does that look like for the communities we serve? Because at the heart, man, like, I think it's very important to say, like, law enforcement officers by and large are good-hearted, big-hearted people. And whether they live in the community or not, they serve that community. And when they're in those communities and they see things happening, and again, I know I use this, this no bail thing. Yeah, it's now all of a sudden the person they arrested a day ago, 3 days ago, 5 days ago, whatever the case it is, for a crime where someone was hurt or where someone's safety of their home was violated, and now they're back out on the street. And now guess what? We have to deal with them again. So one thing I remember being told early on in my career is, as law enforcement, you spend 90% of your time dealing with 10% of the people.
Hmm.
And when that's the case, like, how does that look if that 10% of the people are not going to be held to full account or be taken off the streets for a significant amount of time? And I am in no way, shape, or form advocating for people, like, they get no one should ever be able to bond out or bail out. That's not what I'm saying. The bail is there for a reason, and part of that reason is the continued protection of the community. And when we see reduction in law enforcement numbers, through retirements, through just difficulty in hiring, I worry about that. So that's the concern I have now as I kind of get to the backside of my law enforcement career.
Hmm. I'm kind of wondering. I know you said that like it's tough to come to terms with like how people can do this to each other, how people have a propensity for trouble.
Mhm.
How do you I guess deal with it? Like is it something that you have like a psychiatrist at work that you talk to? Is it venting to your family? Do you just bottle it up? Like how do you deal with
Oh
it?
no.
Yeah, yeah. It's get a dog. Dogs are amazing listeners. Um, no, I think that maybe the first step is maturity on my part, right? And kind of just seeing the way of the world, seeing it's been this way for thousands of years, and I hate to say you just accept it, but I think that becomes part of it. Uh, but I also think it's remembering that empathy is, man, like that's one of the most important parts of a law enforcement officer. Like we all love that law enforcement officer that when I say fills out the uniform, right? They're in good shape. They've got a good head on their shoulders. Their gig line is in place. Their shoes are shined. Like their sunglasses fit their head perfectly. Like all these things. Like we love that in an officer. But the biggest quality really is empathy. Like that is so important. Is just understanding that people have everyone's got a backstory and everyone's got something that they're dealing with. And is in law enforcement, and specifically when I'm talking with young agents about responding to crimes against persons, I remind them that a 911 call is just an invitation to someone's worst day. And that's I think that empathetic approach of like, okay, something went really bad, but it wasn't probably just that one moment. Like there's probably a backstory, and we really need to have empathy, and not just empathy for victims or victims' families, but empathy for the community, empathy for the offender. I think those kind of that reminder and that growth again, that maturity, kind of gave me that perspective that the empathy is really the driving factor behind kind of just being able to, I guess, accept where we're at and what we do.
I like that
Hmm,
answer.
I do too. You know, Another thing I'm kind of curious about. Um, Obviously, it's and maybe you can't talk about it, but like, what is like the worst moment you've ever had being a detective, and what's the best moment you've ever had being a detective?
Oh, geez. It's tough to quantify really what the worst moment is. Kind of back to what I said before, like 911 calls an invitation to someone's worst day. So I've been there with grieving families. I've been there with children who have died. I've been there with young people who have been molested. I've been there. In to say one of them is worse than the other is difficult because they're all bad. They're all bad for that family, that person, that community. Um, so that one's a tough one. Now, best moments. I mean, detective work is, and law enforcement in general, is not about sending people to prison. Like that's not what it is. Like it's about serving the public. It's about providing a sense of community. It's about keeping people, keeping hope alive, keeping the American dream alive. It's allowing people that they should be able to go out and walk their streets. So there have been a lot of those really great moments in my career where people haven't gone to jail. Yeah, I've worked cases. I've worked cases where people have gone to to prison for life, and that feels great. But really, giving folks that sense of safety, giving people answers. Right? Again, as a detective, that's a really important piece. That's kind of what we do: put pieces back together. A lot of times, trying to make sense of the senseless, but whenever you can find answers, it's so important. to do so, and it's so important for the families, again, the communities, and law enforcement as cops. Like, it's you want to have that answer, as much as possible. So those are great moments, but boy, there's nothing like, when you do have those cases with successful resolutions, and whatever that successful resolution is, whether it's finding answers or someone being convicted of a heinous crime, boy, just that thank you that comes from the family, the hugs at the end of the day, those things make it all worth it. Uh, I have families that, I worked cases where their loved ones were killed. I guess it's going to be 16 years ago, so it's 15 and a half, give or take, right now, and they still reach out every year, still reach out, and
Wow.
that to me is like, that's among the best moments, because I to them, I could just as easily symbolize the worst moment of their life. But instead, they keep me in their heart, and they continue to reach out, and I'm really grateful and thankful for that.
That's good. Do you worry? So we talked about AI a little bit.
Yeah.
And New York's been known, or is starting to be known, kind of for the automation and kind of testing these robot police. They have the police dogs, and they're starting to use drones. Do you worry that eventually, when we kind of reach the age of all robotics and automation, that the loss of empathy could kind of it could serve more as a problem than outweigh the benefits of having these automated quote unquote police officers or policing tactics?
Yeah, I think empathy, like, and I talked about it before, right? Empathy is key, and when whether it's a robot or a human that doesn't have empathy, that's just going to exacerbate problems. We really have to keep that at the heart. Is there a place for AI and for these robotic dogs? Absolutely. Like, if we can, if we can replace a robot, a lot easier than we can replace, a true canine, right? A true dog, and definitely more so than we can uh, replace a human. And so, if you say, hey, we're going to send, and I use an example on this, I guess, more than just a police dog, I guess maybe let's talk about just a bomb robot. That's something we see with our arson folks that, gets deployed pretty regularly. If a bomb blows up and it takes out a robot, we'll spend another $100,000 and we'll buy a robot, and we'll call it good. It's a cost of doing business, right? As opposed to somebody else, whether they're killed or not, but, just the traumatic impact of having ordnance go off is, I don't know that you can put a price on that, because it's such a long-term effect. So I think there's a place for it. I think there's a place for robotics, for AI. Drones, I think, again, kind of going back to the surveillance state that we talked about earlier, I think drones are a very tricky and sticky subject, because it's how they're used. It's the use for them. It's, again, as long as it's for public safety, it's not for just, I want to go look in somebody's windows. But if it's a true public safety, I think there's some value in that. It's, you see where, I can speak for Iowa, the Department of Public Safety. The state patrol's got a couple airplanes, right, and they go up in their traffic safety, and they can be used for surveillance in the right situations, where the safety of the officers would be otherwise jeopardized. So I think that there is an absolute purpose and absolute need to have some of that. But I think, again, it's got to be something that's used ethically, morally. It's something that we have to stay on top of, and we have to, again, adapt to the situation and adapt to where the world is at the time. I think it's really important, and I think that's really important. I'm sorry. And when you look at drones, and I think sometimes what happens is, and I can only speak, I guess, to Iowa. I can't speak to New York or anywhere else. But when we talk about drones in Iowa, we're talking about your DJI's drones, or nothing. This is not a military drone that's taking off from an airport somewhere 1,000 miles away and delivering. This is something where someone's standing at the remote control, for lack of a better phrase, looking up at this drone as it flies around. So there's still a human there within the proximity and able to adjust to the situation at hand. So I think there's a place for it. Going back to that, there's a place for it. It just we got to use it right. Got to use it in the right way. And again, that's got to be to protect our communities.
For sure. Yeah, I guess I just technology. I just feel like we're at an inflection point here in the world where there's this like rapid evolving technology that can replace humans, and some states are very much, just do it, replace them all, and there's other states are like, no, that's a terrible idea. So,
And the answer probably is somewhere in the middle,
I'm
right?
sure,
Again,
yeah.
responsibly employing it is really key.
Yeah, has ha- in throughout your time, has technology kind of creeped up for you when it comes to like you specifically? I know you talked about CSI and like the other guys, and even the drone technician, but what about you personally when it comes to, your work? Is technology evolved directly, in front of you, like in your day-to-day uses when you're working?
It has. When I first started, it was pagers. For those that don't know, that's a little box that you wore on your hip, and someone would text you a phone number or a very brief message. It's a very rudimentary form of text messaging, I guess. And then you would have to go and you'd find a phone booth or borrow some phone somewhere to make the call. And now, um, here I am with an iPhone, whatever this is in front of me, iPhone 14, I think. And so I've got a camera, I've got my email, I've got text messaging, I've got all the things that go along with a phone right here at my fingertips. And so my daily life has changed so much, and it's changed in it, some ways for the good, some ways for not so good. I guess it depends on your perspective. One thing that's really important in public service, in any business, is the ability to kind of find a pocket of air, as I talk about. And with all this stuff in our hands, it's a little more difficult to find that pocket of air. How do I get away for 2 hours knowing that the phone could ring, right? So yeah, it's presented rather some unique challenges like that, but it's also, man, it's made me a better investigator. It's made me a better leader of people, and it's helped me stay in contact. And I think that's so important, whether it's with the folks that I work with, other law enforcement in the area, county attorneys, or victims. Like, it just allows me the opportunity to have that right at my fingertips. I don't have to go to the to the office, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30, and be able to make my phone calls. I can do it at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday night, or I can do it at 4 in the morning on a Saturday morning. Like, I can do it at any time. So, yeah, I've seen it evolve quite a bit right in front of me, and just in my daily use. Absolutely.
We haven't. I'm comparing, in my your job to in my brain the Hollywood education. Can you describe, not exactly, but like describe what your day to day looks like? Like, how do you take on cases? Are you just assigned to them? Are you like a specialist in a certain area? Like, how does I'm Hollywood educated, trying to understand your
Yeah.
job day to day.
No, absolutely. First of all, cops are all way better looking than the Hollywood actors, of course. I think that probably went without saying, but I know that was going to be your next question. No,
Course.
it's really unique, right? When I watch it, and my wife will just be like, "Oh, Adam, it's just a TV show," and I'll be saying things like, "Oh my gosh, that's so far fetched," like, "Oh my gosh, that would never happen." Um, but yeah, it's law enforcement is a funny thing. Like on Hollywood, man, it looks like I thought it looked. Like it's going 100 miles an hour with your ass on fire all the time. And it's thankfully it's not that. But unthankfully, I don't know if unthankfully is a word. Unthankfully, it is. It's a lot of. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of whether it's writing a report or writing a subpoena or a search warrant. Like there's a lot of that. Like Hollywood kind of leaves that part out. You mentioned Law and Order before. It's just like, hey, we need a search warrant for this surveillance or whatever it is, and 10 minutes later they show up with a blue piece of paper and they hand the information over and life is good. That's not exactly how it works. It's a much more involved process, and I think it's important to. I guess I want to stop there for a second and just kind of talk real quick about the search warrant process, because I know this gets brought up a lot. Where the police just rammed a search warrant through, or police how could they be there? The police just violated this person's rights, and even though they said they had a search warrant. The search warrant process is actually it's a very deliberate process. It starts with law enforcement. In most cases, it's reviewed by a prosecuting attorney, and then it's reviewed by a judge. And it's not until the judge signs it that a search warrant can actually be executed. So now I can't just say, I want a search warrant for Bob Smith's house and sit down at my computer here and punch one out and then go kick Bob Smith's door in. Right? There's got to be checks and balances. And so I know I kind of got off your comment or your question there, Dougie, with that, but I think it's important for people to understand that because it does come up. But kind of back to your point, with law enforcement, kind of the difference in TV. Thankfully, number one difference is we do not get in as many shootings as TV shows. I know that gets clicks, so to speak, when they have these things. But thankfully, it doesn't happen very often. I can speak to Iowa. We are, if we have 10 in a year, that 10 officer involved shootings in a year, that's a lot. So it's not an everyday thing. It's not every case thing. So I think that's a big thing to put out there. As far as kind of how cases are assigned, where I work with the Division of Criminal Investigation, we are a requested agency, which means we do not have original jurisdiction for investigations, and we have to be asked by a local agency to come in and help. So, for example, a sheriff's office, if they have a homicide, they may call and ask for us to provide investigative assistance resources to help them work the case. And it's not that those agencies aren't capable of handling it. It's just a state like Iowa, there's more law enforcement agencies with less than 10 employees than there are with more than 10 employees.
Wow.
Which is a crazy thing to think about. So if the homicide happens in one of these smaller towns, they probably don't have a full-time detective. And if they do have a full-time detective, in the days and weeks that it takes to investigate this homicide, all the other cases are stacking up behind them. And so with the DCI, we can come in and we provide them a free resource. They can, we send one person, we send 8 people. It doesn't matter. They're never going to see a bill for that. We're just going to come in and we're going to provide them the resource. And we also bring with us then experience, because we get the opportunity to work these kinds of cases across the state. And so when we do that, we are more efficient and proficient at what we do in that process. So I think that's one thing when it comes to assigning cases and kind of how it works. Like I can't speak to NYPD. When we watch cop shows, they center on the places where there's a lot of law enforcement activity: New York, LA, Chicago, Miami. There's not many out there that's like, hey, come watch Marshalltown, Iowa, SVU. Like it's not a thing, right? And but it's like there's really good cops out there doing really good things. It's just we don't get cases quite the same way. Our workload here in Iowa is going to be less. So for me, just to make a generalization like this is how it always is, I can't. I can just kind of speak to what my experience is.
Yeah, that's fair.
And you've got enough of it, I would say. I mean, 28 years of experience is not a light thing.
No, I appreciate that. Is not. It is not. It's given me a gray hair or two, but of course that could have been for my daughter. I just haven't figured it out yet. So
Yeah, probably. Or that or your son.
that's yeah. No, definitely be her.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Oh, I'm kind of curious. Is there anything, I guess, we've asked you a lot of questions. Do you feel like there are any sort of, I know you talked a little bit about like the difference between like TV and real life and stuff, but is there anything else that you wish like people would, better understand about being a detective or being a cop overall or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things, maybe two big things, and maybe some small ones I throw in here, but two big things is number one is cops are people too, and I think that gets missed a lot. Um, whether it's in media or just kind of a public perception that they're somehow just the uniform, just the badge, just the last arrest. That's not it. Law enforcement officers in general are very involved in their communities, not just with their services as police officers, but they're coaches, they're mentors, they're just the person you're standing next to at the football game on a Friday night. They're the person next to you at the grocery store. Like most, like all law enforcement officers are people first. Like we bleed, we cry, we hurt, we are committed to our communities, but we know that sometimes we just need to we have to do what the job requires, and it's not always going to be the most popular. And I think that's when we look at maybe this perception like cops just wanted to arrest someone, cops just wanted to shoot someone. Man, I've been around enough of that to say that's not the truth. And to a person, I would say, if law enforcement officers could put themselves out of business, they would do it. If we could ever get to this utopian state, we would absolutely take that opportunity to be unemployed. But that's where we're at with just kind of the cops are humans first, and cops second, and then kind of just that spin off of it is the vast majority, if not all cops are in it for the right reasons, especially at the start. And they're in it to serve their communities. They're in it to be involved. There's easier jobs out there. Um, there's most people don't say, "Gosh, I want to go be a police officer in small town Iowa and make $55,000 a year for someone to scream, yell, cuss at me, harass me, uh, fight me, shoot at me, whatever the case may be, just because they couldn't find another job." Like they're generally here for the right reasons. They're dedicated to their communities, and they really do want to do well. And cops are not perfect, right? I mean, again, going back to my first point, cops are human first. Like we're gonna make mistakes, we're gonna say stupid things, we're gonna do stupid things, and that's just how it is. But of all the I guess negativity that comes towards bad cops, none of that touches how good cops feel about bad cops. And when you're a good cop, like when bad cops do bad things, like you want them gone, you want them out, you want them held accountable, you want them brought out in front of the public.
Saying they police their own?
No, it's well. I think cops. I don't want to say police their own because that's kind of a piece that is goes gets a little complicated. Sure, we police our own in respect of let's say someone is just rude during a traffic stop. Now, when officer's rude during a traffic stop, um, that probably doesn't require them to lose their job, right? There should be more accountability. That's not something that's acceptable for someone to be rude during a traffic stop, for an officer to be rude during a traffic stop. So that's something like that. We should be able to police our own for things like that. But there are times when officers cross the line and they need to be held to a very high standard, and they need to be treated within the criminal justice system just like everyone else. And I think that's something that good cops really support. We don't, good cops don't support, they don't support, officers that do drunk driving. They're like, that crosses the line. Like, we know better than that. They don't support domestic abusers. Um, those are things that just, as good cops are like, nope, that's unacceptable. We don't accept people that, you know, that intentionally cause harm to another person. And they beat suspects or otherwise use force inappropriately. Like, good cops really don't support that, and nor should they. Um, so I think it's a very important distinction that gets made. Law enforcement's one of those professions, like, if one officer does it, therefore all officers do it. And that's not the reality. That's a talking point that people use. That's a T-shirt slogan that people want to make because good cops are good cops, and we don't want bad cops around.
Yeah, I think social media plays a interesting role here where it loves to get clicks, and one of the ways to do that is to pit two communities against each other as
Sure.
much as possible. Um, and it obviously sways public opinion
Right.
um quite avidly. But I like a lot of your responses because I think it's all very spot on when it comes to
Thank
empathy
you. Yep.
and just helping clarify that the reality is very different from what people are seeing on their phones.
Right.
um,
Right. Right.
yeah. Yeah. I genuinely don't think a lot of people realize how um misconstrued reality is just when
Yep.
it's coming through the phone. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's you kind of talk about that. Sorry, it's um, if you go far enough down the wormhole in social media, and and I know I made the kind of the candid comment before about social influencers, and I love those pictures. Like, this is what it looks like on social media, and this is what it looks like in reality,
Oh yeah, that's a
and
new trend.
there's no comparison, right?
Yeah.
Um, you can do a lot with an iPhone 15 Pro to make lighting look great, and you can zoom in and you can box out everything that's going on around the photo itself, which is great. Like, I love that. Like, because it comes up with some great photos. But when you have the real perspective, when you step back behind the camera and see what's going on, you see the real thing, and I think that that's important. When looking at law enforcement officers, like, hey, step back behind the officer, step back, and see what did this really look like? What is this whole problem? How did we get to this point? I think it's really important.
Yeah. No, for sure. I very much hard agree. Um, where do you see policing heading in the future? Like as far out as you can see. What do you think policing looks like? You know, way out there.
Yep. Yeah, I know I referenced this utopian state where we're all out of work. I don't think that's going to be the case, so we can take that off of the board. So I think what we're going to see with law enforcement going forward, and I think there's going to be a couple interesting things, and the first is this, we see it across the country, and that is issues in recruiting and retention. with officers. Yeah, and so I think that that's the one thing that I'm really watching to determine kind of what it's going to look like, 3 years, 5 years, 25 years from now, because the there the need for law enforcement officers is not going to go away. We talked about it before. We can't just have a robot go out um, without emotion, without empathy, without context, and do the job that a human needs. This is truly a human touch job. This is a public service job. It requires humans to do it. So I think that we've got to find a way, law enforcement, to keep standards high, but increase that recruitment and retention to have law enforcement interactions grow in terms of their positive impact. I think that that's really the kind of the first key that I'm really looking at in this. I think that when we look out kind of where's law enforcement, how do we end up where we're at? I think we're going to see, unfortunately, a larger increase in the cyber policing and the cyber technology realm. Again, just kind of as the natural evolution following the technology trends that we discussed earlier. So I think we're going to see more engagement there. I think we're going to see, as I talked about before, where law enforcement is a reactionary endeavor. I think we're going to see with that cyber technology or with the use of other technologies in law enforcement or other. Let me come back on that. You're going to see technologies used in the furtherance of crimes. I think we're going to see an increase in the visibility, awareness, and capabilities of frontline officers as much as detectives. So I think that's going to be a big piece. And I think part of that is going to come through, again, this recruiting and retention. As we bring in, folks in their 20s who grew up with an iPhone in their hand. I was at a restaurant the other day, and this kid's she was still sitting in a high chair and still in a diaper. So I don't know. Let's just say a year old, and this kid's punching buttons on an iPhone and making it do what he needs it to do.
That's so
And
cool.
I was like, man, that's unbelievable. And I still, like I think I mentioned before, I can like make calls, check my email, and send text messages. Like that's what I've got this. So I've got this $1,000 phone to do. But I think you're going to see like the frontline officers, these young officers that come in through recruiting, are going to be able to just they're going to be so technically sound that it's really going to change the way detectives do work. It's going to change service to our victims. And it's going to hold people to probably a higher account. And it's going to require law enforcement as a whole to really evaluate kind of how we do business. How's that going to be when the 22-year-old officer on the street is, able to, in, 5 minutes, access someone's Ring doorbell and their Arlo cameras and backtrack on someone's IP address while still standing at the scene. How are we as law enforcement executives going to handle that? Because it's a change. Right now it's kind of go out, gather the information, we'll give the information to a detective and they'll follow up on it in the morning. So it's going to make law enforcement more efficient, but it's also going to create kind of, I think, a little bit of a hurdle for us to have to clear in the more near future. So I think we see that, and then again, just to go back to this recruiting and retention piece, and the kind of the comment I made before about more law enforcement agencies with 10 or less than with more than 10. That's how's that going to look when officers that are my age retire, and if those smaller agencies cannot hire officers back in to either live in the small community or meet the standards that they have set, or if the salaries of neighboring agencies are too much higher, they just can't afford them in these small communities. how is that going to affect law enforcement services to those communities? Are we going to see, again, like I know we've seen in some places in the country, but a consolidation of services, instead of having as many, small town local police departments, are we going to go to more county-wide? What about these counties? There's counties out there that only have 9, 10, deputies in it. What are they going to do? How are they going to hire, retain, and support their communities? So I think that there's going to be changes, and I think it starts with kind of right now with the recruiting and retention piece.
All right. Well, Adam, you've talked a lot with us today, and you've answered a lot of questions. Is there anything else you would like to say before we conclude today?
Yeah, make sure that you get your dishes washed before you go to bed. No, guys, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak with you and to also kind of get this information out to your listeners. I think that law enforcement has served me well as a profession. I think law enforcement serves all of us well as parts of the community, and we need good men and women to come in and carry this forward, because it really is the fabric of our communities is good law enforcement. So if we can share this message of positivity with someone who maybe is on the fence about where law enforcement is, and it impacts them positively, I think that's great. If we can get out, we can give this information, and someone says, this is how I want to serve my community, and they want to go be a police officer, I think that's great. But just getting this out there and giving this perspective, I think is invaluable. So I really appreciate you both having me on.
Well, thank you for coming. And I just want to say, I like your positive attitude, and
Thank you.
I think your emphasis on empathy is definitely the best takeaway, I think, from which is just from you for
Thank you.
the entirety of the podcast. I think that is super important, and it's not something I didn't expect, um, but I'm glad that that you expressed a lot of focus on that and its importance. I think that's a very critical. It should be a very critical role in law enforcement. I
Absolutely.
completely agree with you there. So
No, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, 100%. That's what I want to try and impart. That's such a huge key in all of this.